So, in our last lesson, we looked at John F. Kennedy's administration from a domestic standpoint, and we also looked at the Supreme Court and its role in changing life here in America. Now, let's look at Kennedy's administration and its impact on international events, particularly in the framework of the Cold War. You might remember a major issue of the 1960 presidential campaign of the 1960 election was the Cold War and how the candidates would handle the what had become pretty much a permanent standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. Well, when Kennedy took office, there was it was an uncertain time in the Cold War. You might, if you want to remember all the way back to chapter 26, Eisenhower had been planning a summit to try and reduce tensions, a meeting in Paris. Right before the meeting, a U-2 spy plane piloted by Gary Powers is shot down. The Soviets not only capture the wreckage, they capture the pilot. We denied everything, and then they, pulled a rabbit out of their hat and said, "Here's Gary Powers. What do you think about that?" Things were just looking bad. And then throughout the developing world, which, again, if you remember, was really where the Cold War was fought. While it's all about the United States versus the Soviet Union, we never actually fought the Soviet Union. What would occur would be something like Vietnam, as we learned about. There's some lesser developed country in the world, and it's a battle between the United States and the Soviets to win them over, or to install our government, or to make them an ally, right? And so throughout the developing world, you'd had a lot of rebellions and revolutions and wars of liberation and all these sorts of things. Well, John F. Kennedy felt that Dwight Eisenhower, who was a very big believer in, if you remember, massive retaliation. It was Eisenhower who believed that nuclear weapons were the answer. They provided more, and I quote, bang for the buck, right? And so he's the man who built a massive bomber force. And he's the man who built a large missile force and built all sorts of nuclear weapons. Well, John F. Kennedy felt that we needed a more, what he termed, flexible response, that nuclear weapons were not the answer to all of our problems. And if you think about it, a situation like Vietnam, nuclear weapons would never have answered anything. Dropping a nuclear weapon on North Vietnam isn't going to solve the fact that you have a guerrilla uprising in South Vietnam. It might help South Vietnam some, but you can't nuke the guerrillas in South Vietnam. I don't think South Vietnam would be very happy with us dropping nuclear weapons on their country to save their country. And so Kennedy said we had become too dependent on nuclear weapons and we needed a more flexible response, as he termed it. And so he pushed for a buildup of what we call conventional forces, non nuclear, traditional things, tanks, regular aircraft, troops. Um, Now, that is more costly. Eisenhower was right. You get more bang for your buck with nuclear weapons, by far, no questions, right? Um, so Kennedy's approach is going to be more expensive, but he felt like it was more in tune with the needs of the Cold War. Also, Kennedy was a big fan in developing what we would call asymmetrical forces or special forces. It was John F. Kennedy who called for the creation of a unit that specialized in guerrilla warfare. That unit became the Green Berets, which we still have today. Kennedy, I'm not going to say was instrumental in starting the unit that became the Navy SEALs, but he did promote the development of that kind of unit. And so a lot of the special forces units that we have today were the result of John F. Kennedy saying, sometimes I don't need a nuclear weapon. Sometimes I need a group of guys who can go behind enemy lines and do things. Now, the answer to all of your problems isn't always military force. And so John F. Kennedy practiced a little bit of dollar diplomacy, so to speak. I am, of course, referencing the foreign policy of William Howard Taft in the Caribbean. You might remember William Howard Taft believed, unlike Teddy Roosevelt, who was a fan of his big stick, speaking softly and carrying a big stick, William Howard Taft liked to try and use money to solve a lot of America's Latin American problems. John F. Kennedy felt like that might be an answer too. Latin America was still a problem. Latin America had not been our friends for a while. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had tried to promote a better relationship between the United States and Latin America, but the U.S. and Latin America were still not getting along, and Latin America was struggling. Many of the countries of Latin America suffered from extreme poverty. There were a handful of incredibly wealthy, influential, powerful people in control of the economy, the government, the military, and then there's everybody else who's basically a poor landless peasant. Um, Matter of fact, because of these conditions, Latin America was ripe for communist or left wing revolutions. We even talked about one in Guatemala, although I wouldn't call that a revolution, but a socialist who was elected president, um, or I guess premier, prime minister, whatever. Um, Anyhow, what usually happened in Latin America is there'd be some left wing revolution that would try to topple the government. We, in turn, would support the existing government because it wasn't communist. So we would actually help these corrupt, dictatorial, right wing, maybe even fascist governments stay in power because the alternative would be to let the communists win. And that kind of didn't look good. And let's face it, these governments tended to favor American business over their own people. And we just didn't do a good job in Latin America. To try and fix things, John F. Kennedy promoted the Alliance for Progress, a bunch of projects and programs where we were going to try and help these Latin American governments help their people. We wanted to create what we called a quote free and prosperous Latin America. Over a 10-year period, the United States spent over $20 billion in Latin America, building schools, housing, healthcare facilities, helping develop the land, all sorts of stuff. In some countries, we had some success. Chile, Colombia, Venezuela, and a few of the Central American countries had some real reform and development. But in some countries, what happened was the corrupt governments pocketed the money and the people never saw it. And that's kind of the story of Latin America, since its independence from the Spanish Empire. There is a tradition, unfortunately, of corrupt governments, whether they be right wing, left wing, however you want it, that just take advantage of the situation. And as I said, America is guilty of backing some of those corrupt right wing governments. But again, it's because they weren't left wing, they weren't communist. We basically had to pick a team, and we picked the non communist team, and they weren't always the best of teams. Another way that John F. Kennedy thought we could fight communism, right? So we're using special forces and flexible response. We're basically trying to buy friends. Another way that he thought we could help fight communism, the Peace Corps, an organization where young Americans would volunteer to perform humanitarian work. After training, volunteers would spend 2 years in a country helping do, I don't know, build a sewer system, educate children, train medical technicians, work in a hospital, teach English, build roads. By 1963, Peace Corps volunteers were working in 30 countries around the globe. The Peace Corps is still active today. It's one of the legacies of John F. Kennedy. I actually have a family member who worked in the Peace Corps. He spent close to a year and a half in Africa teaching English to school children. Some of you might go, sir, you just said 2 years. He was released from his duties with the Peace Corps early. The Peace Corps actually had to evacuate him because in the region he was at, a little bit of violence broke out and it became unsafe for an American to be where he was. And so the Peace Corps said, rather than resettle you for an awkward 6 months, we'll just call it even. But I had a family member just a couple of years ago serving in the Peace Corps in Africa, teaching English to children. So there's a program of John F. Kennedy still around today. One other way where John F. Kennedy tried to show the world that America was the bestest and that you shouldn't join those dirty Russians was the space race, one of my personal favorites. I don't know how many of my students are aware, I have a passion for aviation. My childhood dream, and it was even a goal if you would have asked me in high school, was to become an astronaut. I've always been fascinated with flight and space travel and all that. And so one of my personal passions is the space race. John F. Kennedy took this kind of sort of competition with the Russians when it came to satellites and sending men into space and such, and he took it to a whole new level. You know, that's not to say that Dwight Eisenhower ignored space. I mean, Eisenhower started NASA, Eisenhower did a lot of things. But Eisenhower did not grasp how this captured the public's imagination and the world's imagination and how it could be used as marketing. I know this sounds a little weird, but John F. Kennedy understood that every time the Russians put something into space ahead of us, it was a way for the Russians to go look at our cool technology. And you know what gives us this cool technology, or STEM, if you will? A better education system. And why do we have a better education system? Because we're the Soviet Union and we have a better system. I mean, it might sound it might sound logical, it might sound crazy, but that's how they did it, right? Both sides were able to basically advertise, saying that whenever they had a success in space, it was the product of superior technology. And superior technology was the product of a superior education system, industrial system, all that, right? You know, university system, whatever it is. John F. Kennedy understood that. And so John F. Kennedy was committed to using space and the space race as a way to advertise American supremacy. It was John F. Kennedy who, in fact, in 1961, he actually said that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade of out of landing a man on the moon and safely returning him to Earth. The book left that out. We eventually did that in July of 1969 when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon for a little while and then came home a couple days later with their friend Mike Collins. I do like to point out, fun fact, when John F. Kennedy stood before the United States Congress and said, we're going to put a guy on the moon before the decade ends, he did it in the spring of 61. So he's first of all saying we're going to do it in less than 9 years. Or excuse me, less than 10 years. We got like 9.5. America's total time in space, manned time in space, 15 minutes. Not even 15 minutes, actually. The only American at that point who'd been in space was Alan Shepard, the first American in space. He flew a suborbital flight. We basically shot him up into space and he fell right back down. He was in space a grand total of maybe 5 minutes. So we've been in space a grand total of 5 minutes, and this guy's like, we're going to go to the moon and come back. And we did it. But anyhow, moving on. John F. Kennedy had a really exciting presidency. He wasn't president that long. He was president about 1,000 days, actually. But man, he oversaw some interesting crises in the Cold War. The Cold War got awful warm when he was president. The first crisis came right as soon as he became president, really. The Bay of Pigs. So Fidel Castro, a communist leader, rebel, had overthrown the corrupt Cuban dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista in 1959. Batista had been one of those right-wing sort of dictators who was pro-America, so we were cool with him and he was our buddy. And we let him take advantage of his people and kind of run his country as a corrupt dictatorship. And in return, he gave America cheap sugar and outstanding vacation spots. Matter of fact, famed American author Ernest Hemingway had a place in Cuba. He loved going to Cuba. It was his favorite spot. A lot of people like going to Cuba. It's a pretty cool place. Well, unfortunately, the people of Cuba were tired of living in poverty and living under the dictatorship of Batista. And so in 1959, Fidel Castro and Cuban revolutionaries, communist Cuban revolutionaries, were able to overthrow Batista. Almost immediately, Castro established a friendly relationship with the Soviet Union and began doing all kinds of communist things like land reform and seizing foreign-owned businesses in the name of the Cuban people and all sorts of stuff. We were not excited that Russia now had an ally 90 miles from the southern coast of Florida, right? And so President Eisenhower, so it's 1959, Eisenhower's still president. President Eisenhower and the CIA began to secretly train Cuban refugees, exiles, because I do want to point that out too. When Fidel and the Cuban communists took over, A lot of people who were anti-communist or attached to the Batista regime fled because they knew their days were numbered. Most of them fled to the United States. So, the CIA began to secretly train and arm a bunch of Cuban exiles. They were known as La Brigada, the brigade. We basically began making our own CIA trained army. The plan was they would invade, and their invasion would rally the Cuban people to come together to overthrow Fidel Castro because the theory was, the CIA said, most people in Cuba actually weren't communist or pro Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro and a handful of Cuban communists had toppled the government, and they were really holding on by force and threat of force. And if a group of anti-Castro fighters landed, the people of the country would rise up and join a revolution to overthrow Castro. Communism solved. They didn't do any of this though. Like they trained the army, they didn't actually invade. When Kennedy became president, his advisors were like, "Hey, Mr. President, guess what? Good news. You get to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro and be a hero and prove to everyone you are truly a cold warrior and you're an anti-communist." Eisenhower and the CIA had been putting together this armed force and blah, 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 but we got this plan. He just never unleashed it because it was an election year. And congratulations, it's yours. Just sign here. And so his advisors told him it was a winning plan, can't fail, let's do it. He signed on the dotted line. April 17th, 1961, 1,400 armed Cuban rebels landed at the Bay of Pigs right here in southern Cuba. They pretty much almost immediately were doomed. The landing craft, some of them broke down. They got stranded on a coral reef, stuff that happened when we fought the Japanese in World War II. A big part of the plan was American air support. I don't know how much of that Kennedy was aware of. There were aircraft carriers over here that were supposed to use strike planes to support the rebels. And John F. Kennedy was like, wait, we're not sending American aircraft over Cuba. Are you crazy? Without American air support, the rebels had no chance. There was no rebellion. The Cuban military quickly descended on the Bay of Pigs and crushed the invasion. Within 2 days, all of La Brigada had been killed or captured. It was a humiliation for the American government. Obviously, everyone in the world knew that these people had been sent there by the American military. All of their equipment came from America. Like all of these people were captured with American equipment, and the invasion craft were old American World War II surplus. The whole world knew that America tried this and failed miserably. So that was embarrassing. Not long after the Bay of Pigs, John F. Kennedy faced another embarrassing moment. In June of 1961, he did go to Vienna, Austria, to meet with Nikita Khrushchev. And Nikita Khrushchev thought that he was going to see just how far this young new president was willing to go, right? He figured this guy's a pushover. Nikita Khrushchev was tired of people running away from communist countries through Berlin. You see, if you could get into West Berlin, you could hitch a plane flight or a train ride, but mostly a plane flight, from West Berlin to the Western world. If you wanted to escape communism, all you had to do was get to West Berlin because the planes from West Berlin flew straight from West Berlin to Paris, London, anywhere in the Western world. You could escape that way. Every year, thousands of skilled people were basically using West Berlin as an escape tunnel from communist East Germany and other communist countries in Eastern Europe. And so he demanded that the Western powers recognize East Germany um, as an independent country, and that the United States, Great Britain, and France withdraw from Berlin and give East Germany complete control of Berlin. Berlin is in the heart of East Germany. And Khrushchev just said, I'm tired of this weird island that is throwing a wrench in everything. You people need to abandon West Berlin and give all of Berlin to East Germany and put an end to this. John F. Kennedy said, yeah, we're not doing that. We're going to continue to maintain our position in West Berlin. Khrushchev's answer was to build that wall. That's right. The Berlin Wall, gentlemen. Pretty much overnight, the Soviets began constructing a wall to isolate West Berlin from the rest of East Germany. That is the thing that confuses students all the time. The wall was to keep people from East Germany from fleeing to West Berlin. It wasn't to keep the West Berliners in. You didn't have to keep the West Berliners in. People in West Berlin were happy to live in West Berlin. They weren't going anywhere. Khrushchev actually built a wall to keep his people in, right? This is East Berlin over here. This is West Berlin. That guy's walking his dog. He's a West Berliner. He can walk up and spray paint the wall if he wants. This is a military patrol going along the dead zone in East Berlin, right? There are minefields, there are guard towers, there are snipers, there are attack dogs. This is East Germany. If you try to escape to West Germany, you're dead. But again, it was the East Germans who built it. So they built a wall to keep their people trapped in, so to speak, or from getting to West Berlin. The Berlin Wall was a symbol of the Cold War. It stood for 30 years. It wasn't torn down until 1990, 1989, 1990. I was too young to understand it. I remember seeing the footage on TV, and of course my parents. It was a big deal. My brother, who's 10 years older, he understood. I didn't get it. I was a little kid, and people were tearing down a big concrete wall. I didn't get it. The wall was covered in graffiti. I didn't get it, unfortunately. But it was a memorable moment. These are actually East German guards guarding the border line as the wall is being built, right? So as the wall was being constructed, they actually had to post armed guards to prevent anyone from like running across the line before the wall was built. So Kennedy got to be president while the wall was built. He didn't do anything. I mean, he obviously wasn't happy, but it's not like he can tear down the wall that they built on their side of the border. The final crisis is the one that you should probably remember the most because it's the closest the world has ever come to nuclear holocaust. Well, it's tied actually. But in October of 1962, the United States detected that Soviet technicians and equipment were in Cuba and they were constructing medium range ballistic missiles, intermediate range ballistic missiles. Basically missiles that would deliver nuclear warheads to basically two-thirds of the United States. They were building nuclear missile launch sites in Cuba. And these missiles, again, would be able to hit anywhere basically east of the Mississippi River. And then, parts of Texas, Oklahoma. They would be able to target something like two-thirds of America's military forces. Several of America's major military bases would be within 10 minutes flight time, less than 10 minutes. Barksdale Air Force Base, home to a B-52 unit. It's in Louisiana. It would be hit in 5 minutes. DC would have, I think, less than 10 minutes. From launch to impact, you'd have less than 10 minutes before DC would be hit. Our major naval base at Norfolk, Virginia, similar. This basically made America under the threat of nuclear annihilation before we'd be able to respond. This totally upset the balance of power. Now, these are actually intelligence photos that these are examples of some of the photos that showed it. Now, you're not an expert at analyzing aerial reconnaissance photos, but there were people who could tell, that these were obviously transport containers that would house those medium range missiles, and this is another missile trailer, and this is the launch erector or thing that would stand the missile up to vertical so it could fire, all that stuff. Um, what do we do, right? What do we do? Kennedy's advisors were divided. They didn't know what to do. Some people advised airstrikes. Take out the missiles before they're ready. They're not ready yet. They're obviously still constructing the launch sites. Take out the missiles before they're ready. And Kennedy's like, what's going to happen if we do that? Well, first of all, Kennedy was like, how do we know we've got all the missiles? How do we know that we found all the missile sites? Like, what if there's a missile that we missed? What if we don't get them all? And they're like, well, as soon as the missile's ready, they're going to fire it. And he's like, so we've got to get all the missiles on the first go? And they're like, no, 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 Mr. President. We will attack all the missile sites and we'll follow it up with a full scale invasion of Cuba. And we will take out the Castro regime and we will eliminate communism from Cuba. End of story. And then John F. Kennedy's like, so let me get this straight. We're going to bomb Cuba. Yes, sir. And we're going to invade Cuba. Yes, sir. And what are the Russians going to do? They're like, well, Mr. President, the Russians are going to invade West Berlin. They're going to try and conquer West Berlin. And he's like, we have men in West Berlin. They're like, yes, sir. Can our men in West Berlin stop a Soviet attack on West Berlin? Oh, no, sir. There is no way. They're horribly outnumbered and horribly outgunned. They will not be able to hold back that attack. He's like, so we're going to lose West Berlin? No, sir. Our troops in West Berlin are armed with small tactical nuclear weapons. They will use their small tactical nuclear weapons to stop the Russian attack on West Berlin. He's like, so we're going to use nukes outside of West Berlin. Yes, sir, we are. Okay, what are the Russians going to do? They will respond by simply nuking West Berlin. All right, so they're going to nuke West Berlin. And then we are going to nuke the Russians. So we're going to have a nuclear war. They're like, yes, sir. So what's going to happen? Well, we're going to win, sir, because we have more nuclear missiles and more bombers. Yeah, a few million Americans will die, but Russia will end up a burnt piece of charcoal. We win the Cold War. John F. Kennedy was like, okay, let me just summarize. It's going to start with a bombing of Cuba. It's going to end with a full-scale nuclear war, but it's all good. More Russians will die than Americans. And they're like, yeah, now you got it. John F. Kennedy was like, anybody else got any ideas? Eventually, they came up with the answer of a blockade of Cuba. The plan was the American Navy would stop Soviet ships from delivering any more missiles, any more technicians, any more stuff. We were basically going to limit the number of nuclear weapons in Cuba. We were then going to warn the Russians that any weapon launched from Cuba would be considered an attack by the Soviet Union, and we would launch a full-scale nuclear attack on the Russians, not on Cuba. At this point, I mean, the world is sitting on the brink of a nuclear war because the missiles are still in Cuba. There were a whole bunch of communications back and forth and secret negotiations, telegrams, etc. Eventually, a deal was made. And for 13 days, I'd like to point out, for 13 days in October of 1962, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. The absolute brink of nuclear war. American nuclear forces were brought to their highest alert level ever in the history of strategic air command. I mean, we were razor thin close. And there were a bunch of missteps. There were a bunch of moments that could have gone bad, right? Mistakes could have been made, and fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. If you really want to learn, I highly advise, if you're interested, to read up on the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's amazing we're all here. So many mistakes were made. We got so lucky. But for 13 days, the world teetered, and eventually a deal was made. The Russians would pull the missiles out of Cuba. In return, America would publicly pledge that we would not invade Cuba. And there was a private side deal. Private. We would pull our short-range missiles out of Turkey. That was a big thing. The Russians were like, so let me get this straight. We can't have missiles 90 miles from the United States and Cuba, but you're allowed to have nuclear missiles 90 miles from the Soviet Union and Turkey. That's not fair. So America said, okay, we will withdraw our short-range missiles in Turkey. You just can't say anything. Like, you can't embarrass us like that. All right, we'll give you that one. We'll openly say we want to invade Cuba, and we'll quietly remove the missiles from Turkey. And that was the deal. Interestingly, neither man wanted a nuclear war because they knew it would wipe out their countries. This idea of only a few million Americans would die and that's acceptable. John F. Kennedy was like, that's not acceptable. Large chunks of America being turned to nuclear waste is not acceptable. Millions of dead Americans is not acceptable. no man wanted a nuclear war. And so they did negotiate an end to it on October 28th. Now, here's a low-level flight by actually a Navy reconnaissance plane, giving them a little more detail. But impact of the Cuban Missile Crisis on history. Well, for instance, in August of 1963, the United States and the Soviet Union negotiated an end to nuclear weapons testing in the air. We could still test weapons underground in like tunnels. But basically, this brought an end to the nuclear weapons testing programs of both countries, which had gotten quite sizable and ridiculous. I showed you some of those when we were in the Cold War. I mean, we were setting off nukes in space. It was nuts. We basically announced an end to nuclear weapons testing in 1963 to help kind of take the tension down. We also established a hotline. A lot of people don't know that one. Basically, we installed a direct phone line from the Kremlin to the White House and vice versa. So in moments of crisis, the president could pick up the phone and call the leader of the Soviet Union, or the leader of the Soviet Union could call the president, because they realized one of the problems was this complex back and forth, going through embassies, going through ambassadors. Both men agreed we needed to be able to have face to, well, not face to face, but direct communication, phone communication between the two. I do want to say that this marked the downfall of Nikita Khrushchev, basically having to pull back. He'd risked putting weapons in Turkey or Cuba, and it backfired. This was his downfall. Basically, in 1964, he's going to be quietly toppled, and he'll be replaced as a leader. I do want to say that this event, though, did show the American people that the Soviets had spent the last decade really, really working hard to build up their military to not only compete but overcome the United States. And it turns out we were behind the Russians in conventional forces. There might not be a missile gap, and there might not be a long-range bomber gap, but there was definitely a gap in the size of our militaries. And the United States is going to go on a spending spree in the 1980s, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks, under Ronald Reagan, where we will have to try and catch up with them in that area. Now, unfortunately for John F. Kennedy, his presidency is going to come to a startling end. On November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy and his wife were riding in a parade, if you will, motorcade, in downtown Dallas, Texas. And suddenly John F. Kennedy was assassinated by a sniper. He was riding in an open-topped car, waving to the crowd, and suddenly he was hit by, it depends on who you ask, but his head basically erupted. And he died shortly thereafter at a hospital in downtown Dallas. A man named Lee Harvey Oswald was blamed for the assassination. So I usually show this to my students. The American people did not know about this recording until 1975. As I said, he was assassinated in November of 63. This is what's called the Zapruder Film. Abraham Zapruder filmed this with his 8mm home video camera. This is the only recording that we know of. There are a handful of still photos that are taken during the shooting, right after he's hit. This is the only video footage that we are aware of the actual shooting of the president. So again, America did not see this for about a decade. And of course, it's going to be a major part of the eventual investigation. I will warn you, it is a bit graphic in the sense of you are going to see part of John F. Kennedy's head literally getting blown off. I'll tell you when it's over. But here we go. And there's a narration I'm not going to put. But anyhow, and I apologize for the quality, but this is 1963 home recording. There's John F. Kennedy waving. He goes behind a roadside, unfortunately, but he emerges and he grabs his throat. He's been hit. His wife was Jack, what's wrong? And there you go. And yes, that was part of John F. Kennedy's skull coming off. His wife reaching back to pick up parts of his skull. Secret Service agent jumping on. They speed off. He dies at a hospital. Um, Now, that film was the key piece of evidence that eventually got shown to the American people. Um, Eventually, the man who supposedly was arrested, well, not supposedly, the man who was arrested for the assassination, a former Marine who had turned communist named Lee Harvey Oswald. He supposedly had sniped the president from the sixth floor window of the Texas School Book Depository, which was just behind where the president's car was driving at that time. He was arrested. He was taken to police custody. Um, and then, as he was being transferred from the Dallas Police Department station to I can't remember where off the top of my head, he's in the basement of the Dallas Police Department headquarters in the parking garage. All of a sudden, a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby walks up and shoots the guy in the stomach. And so Oswald dies before he's ever put on trial, right? In police custody. Jack Ruby is captured. I mean, he's not like going to get away. He's captured. Um, and eventually, when they asked Jack Ruby, he said he did it to save Jack Kennedy's widow from a trial and all to avenge Jack Kennedy. I don't know. It's a convoluted mess. But the guy that was originally arrested for the crime never got to stand trial because he got killed 2 days later. Eventually, there will be an investigation headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren, hence the name of the commission, the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission did not satisfy every American. There were a lot of questions that were made. There was a movie that was made in the late 80s, early 90s called JFK by Oliver Stone that dramatizes a lot. But the biggest issue, long story short, they claim that Oswald fired 3 shots in the span of only a few seconds, um, and that he did what he did. The other issue, the number of wounds that both John F. Kennedy and Governor Connally sustained. Governor Connally was the man sitting in front of John F. Kennedy in that car. It resulted in this famed magic bullet theory where the Warren Commission claims that one of the bullets that was fired, like, hit John F. Kennedy, turned this many degrees, hit Governor Connally, made a U-turn, did this, did that. Like, one bullet, like, struck them 5 separate times. That's why it's called the magic bullet theory. And of course, that has led to all sorts of theories, and he was shot from the front, and then and then people have claimed you look at that fatal shot, his head, it goes back and to the left. They're saying that Lee Harvey Oswald fired from behind and to the right, which would make his head go down and to the left, not back and to the left, and so all sorts of stuff, right? I'm not a forensic expert. I'm not, on the show CSI, but there are a lot of people who basically have done CSI sort of stuff over the decades and have claimed the Warren Commission can't be right. I don't know. Let's just put it this way. America was traumatized. I mean, first of all, the president got shot in front of tens of thousands of people while he was driving in a parade, right? And then there was his funeral, which was a huge national, thing that was televised. And there was a moment, and it's in your textbook, and it's gut wrenching, honestly, as a father. There's a picture of John F. Kennedy's little son saluting his father's coffin as it goes by in the parade. It's awful if you're a parent to look at that photo. Um, but I mean, America was traumatized by that. I mean, this young guy with a wife and 2 little kids just blown away by a sniper in front of all of us, the funeral, everything. Um, John F. Kennedy, he died a martyr in that sense. This is going to sound horrible, so please bear with me. Follow me through the whole thing. Being assassinated was the best thing for his legacy. That's horrible. I understand that. But he's always remembered for that, right? He's remembered as the guy who got murdered in front of America, right? Horribly. And no one talks about his failed new frontier, or the fact that he didn't get along with Congress, or the fact that his tax cuts didn't get through, or the fact that while he was president, the Soviets were able to sneak weapons into Cuba. And yeah, we were able to avoid nuclear war, but they snuck the missiles in the first place, and they built the Berlin Wall and the Bay of Pigs, and on and on and on. His 1,000 days were not exactly a victory lap. Um, Nobody talks about that. Everybody talks about that day in Dallas when the man got murdered in front of everyone. So I'm not saying it's a good thing for John F. Kennedy, but it's a thing everybody remembers. If you ask the average American to name three things about John F. Kennedy's presidency, they can tell you he got murdered, and they might be able to tell you a second. A third actual detail, maybe not, right? Um, he was an amazing person, personality wise. He brought a whole new charisma and attitude and sort of swagger to the office of the presidency for that brief time. People have been trying to recapture that, right? Every time we get a young guy running for president, people compare him to Kennedy, right? Because Kennedy set the model for what the young cool president's supposed to be. And following that traumatic moment in Texas, the new president will be his vice president, Lyndon Johnson. So in our next lesson, we will look at how Lyndon Johnson, his 5 years roughly as president of the United States, what did he do?